The East Yorkshire coast, midway up the right-hand side of England, just above the River Humber, an area that I'm going to cover between Whitby and right down to the Spurn Point, which is the furthermost point sticking out to the north of the River Humber. But in particular, although I'm going to show you these other areas, coming right down from Whitby, I'm going to concentrate on the areas between Flamborough Head and Hornsea. Hornsea is where I started my first teaching post, many years ago now, and things were very different then. So different that in fact we've seen fish stocks almost disappear, and the life that I'm going to show you here is now a past way of life. I'm going to intermingle this filming with past Super 8 filming on a very old camera, and then show some of these same spots with new digital film work, which will be much clearer. Even though the images of some of the old filming may be a little blurry, they have a rather nice dreamlike quality, and I do hope you enjoy seeing this past life of mine and the coast as it used to be, and a way of life that used to be. The boat that you see me using at this time is a traditional Coble. It's a smaller version called a pebble cobble and was built in fiberglass. This particular one was an insurance write-off, and in fact it had a hole made through it, being brought over a breakwater once in a storm, but was successfully mended and gave me many years of service and saved my life more than once. At a later date I had a cabin fitted to this as well, and it went many places with me, even up to the far north of Scotland, up salmon rivers and fishing on Loch Ness, all sorts of wonderful and beautiful places. I've had many boats, including a 21-foot yacht, a Jaguar Alacrity. I've had cruisers, high-speed cruisers, which made the comfort of going out and fishing off Flamborough much greater. And here we can see where I used to go. You'll see the X's marked. At the bottom there's Hornsea, and then there's Bridlington, and then at the far right-hand top you saw Flamborough. Just around from that was another X showing Flamborough Head. And just around from Flamborough, of course, there's North Landing, which we'll see later in the film as well, a delightful little cove. Here's an example of the basic fishing tackle I used to use. That's called a muppet. It's a rubber squid, and at the end of that line we would have a piece of silver piping, aluminium or chromed piping, with a great big treble hook at the end, which we jig at the bottom, and the cod would think it's an ordinary bottom fishing rig with a lead, a length of trace about 2'6" long, on which there'd be a single hook, and we would use lugworm or limpets or mussels. This is an example of just how rough the North Sea can become, and in fact I'll show another piece of filming shortly after this done down at Hornsea and Whitby to show the present state of how the weather can be just the same. This short piece of film was made with a few students at the school for a local competition at the Hornsea potteries that used to exist then, making pottery. They no longer make the pottery now, it's just a sales centre. It was shortly after such a storm that I first visited Hornsea when on interview for my teaching post there, and the wonderful thing was that there were masses of seaweed thrown up by the storm even though it had calmed down, and several of the young lads were there picking something out of the lines of seaweed and the flotsam on the beach. When I approached them they were pulling lugworms out. Lugworms are great big sandworms that live under the sand there locally, and these were called gullies. They were in fact almost black and about 1'6" long. Huge things that were disturbed and washed out and sucked out with the storms and then washed up on the coast, and these lads would go and pick these up and use them for bait later, much easier than trying to dig the things out. And they could be frozen as well, so they'd be wrapped up in sawdust and newspapers and then frozen up for use for bait fishing for cod later on in the winter. Unfortunately, these great big black lug or gullies have now gone much the same way as the fish stocks, over-digging and people using them not only for bait but to sell to other fishermen for bait, and wherever there's money there's going to be somebody greedy who overuses the stocks. So now we don't see so many of these worm casts at low water. You had to go down on the biggest of tides to get these big worms because they were the furthest out in the beach, and a big tide comes up a long way but it also goes out a long way. The view we're looking at now is the same view you saw just now of the very rough sea, and that's the little house I used to have when I first went to Hornsea, the ground floor flat there. I moved on from that one to this little cottage, which is where you'll see the boat on its trailer and the dog running around at the beginning of this film. This short piece of filming was taken at Whitby, which is further down the coast. The coast is very varied in this area, and coming from Flamborough, or from Whitby in fact, right the way down to Flamborough, it's all chalk cliffs. And then from Flamborough coming round to South Landing and into Bridlington, the cliffs disappear down into clay cliffs and banks of sand and shingle. Then from the shingle above Bridlington it comes round to beautiful golden sands, from Bridlington almost all the way down to Spurn Point. At Spurn Point it then turns into estuary, mudflats and all the estuary and wading birds. Down at this area below Bridlington there's a lot of coastal erosion, with the sea constantly battering away at the clay cliffs, and they're losing about a metre or a yard a year, which is quite considerable. And in recent years we've seen entire hotels disappearing over the cliffs with this erosion. The design of the Yorkshire Coble, my boat, was based on the Viking longship with a very high bow and a long narrow stern, and they were designed for beach launching and coming in to the beach with the bows facing out to sea. This meant that of course the bows were able to take the impact of the waves as they came in or went out. And they are a displacement boat, not a speed boat. This means that they are very stable, not fast, but don't easily capsize. So you're able to get out through seas like this in an emergency, or if a sea like this gets up, you're able to come in backwards, facing the waves, and let the waves just drive you in. You'll also note when you see me launching the boat from its trailer that I launch in reverse. I launch actually the bow directly into the water from the trailer, rather than launching the stern first where the sea could break over it and over the engine. Well, let's move on from this rough sea to some earlier filming of actually fishing off Hornsea with a small beam trawl and with trammel nets. And here you see me launching the boat bow first. Even though it's a calm sea, it's much more comfortable and the boat just slides off the trailer bow first straight into the waves. I made up my own small beam trawl, and this was used towed behind the boat at low water, about 50 yards out from shore in about 8 or 9 foot of water, and we were quite successful and had some quite large sole, lemon sole and Dover sole. And of course it was rather fun that we had many other little catches in there of baby skate, crabs and all sorts of other young fish that just happened to be caught, and we returned them. As a teacher, of course, I had many students who wished to join me and come with me and crew. These are two young lads here. The young man on the right is one that was mentioned at the earlier of the film, and that was a very large mackerel that that boy caught, probably a record if we'd known it. He moved on later to work on the North Sea oil rigs, so his taste for the sea continued afterwards. But let's move on again now to looking at netting. We've done some trawling, but here we're setting a trammel net. Now, a trammel net is a net in 3 layers. It has 2 outer meshes each side, sandwiching an inner mesh. The inner mesh is quite small, normally about 4-inch mesh, and the outer mesh is about a 10-inch mesh. And the way it works is the fish swims into the net, tries to turn away, but in fact bags itself as it turns by twisting itself between the small and the larger outer net. And that means you catch all sorts of fish that way. The nuisance of it though is also that the crabs love it and get totally tangled up. And then I feel it would be rather nice now to show you the rest of the area. Let's go further up the coast, right up to Whitby. So you can see here the lower X showing Hornsea, and then the one at the top actually shows North Landing. And these were my main fishing areas. When I lived at Hornsea I would fish just off the coast and sometimes motor right across at a diagonal from that bottom X to the top right hand one. A long trip in a slow boat. From here we can get a wonderful view looking down over the rooftops of Whitby across to the far side of the river, looking north in this case.